All right, so I think we are going to go ahead and get started then. Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's session on cover cropping in tunnel spaces. My name is Talia Plaskett, and I am the Protected Crop Specialist at Perennia. So there's been a lot of talk about cover crops in the last few years, and that is primarily focused on field production. So I'm really excited to be able to host today's session, which is going to focus on cover crops in protected spaces. Soil health in tunnels, regardless of the structure that you're using, can be difficult to manage without the right tools to do so. And these protected soils are unique compared to field soils, and it's important that we address those differences and how our management strategies are then going to differ compared to an outdoor setup. So the name of the game here is to maximize soil health and the productivity of those soils, ensuring that they're able to support crop production well into the future. And so this is obviously a very large and complicated topic. We're really only going to be able to lay the foundation here today, but it's really about, getting to that level ground, and then we can start to build on that towards a sustainable future. So before we dive into the good stuff, I just wanted to give a really brief overview of Perennia's protected agriculture program so far. For those of you who were on the webinar back in February, I apologize. This is going to be a repeat, a lot of this information, but I will keep it brief. So the Protected Ag program was officially launched in June 2020, and I just wanted to highlight some of the work that's been done so far and what's coming up next. So the primary focus so far has been just getting a feel for the protected ag sector and understanding what the major questions and needs are surrounding the commodity. We launched an initial greenhouse survey in October 2020, and we're hoping to do the same this fall/winter just to get a sense of how things have changed and just to see how we're doing so far as well. So any and all feedback is going to be useful for us to guide the direction of the program and the material that we generate. So please feel free to communicate those to me directly or stay tuned for that survey where you can submit all of your hopes and dreams surrounding protected ag. So in addition to this initial survey, I've been working on some resource development here as well. Again, this is a really big, broad topic, especially where we're starting from the ground up. So we have made some headway, and I do look forward to continuing to build that resource base for protected farms across Nova Scotia. And so this is just a screenshot of our website. I just wanted to give a bit of a basic navigation overview here, just so that you guys can find all of the fantastic resources that we have on our website. So you're going to head to this agriculture tab on the top, and you're going to see production information right there. And once you open up production information, you'll see that there is a protected crops heading there as well. And once you open one of those commodities, you're going to see that you have the option to select vegetables, berries, cannabis, or ornamentals. Each of those groups are then going to have these 4 sections of resources here. So we have fact sheets, pest management essentials, recommended resources, and videos. And so these resources are not necessarily limited to things that we have produced. So you can see on the screen here, we've got links to Cornell and OMAFRA as well. Really just aiming to be sort of a gathering place for awesome information. And so I won't spend too much time talking about the program. There's just a few highlights that I want to mention just to give you a sense of how Protected Ag is working its way into Perennia's regular scheduled programming and how it will continue into the future based on your feedback, questions, and the evolving state of the industry. So some of the examples we've got, we did a couple virtual field day sessions back when COVID was in its full state, as well as 2 dedicated sessions in our Getting Into the Weeds webinar series from 2021. We were also able to bring in a world expert on cannabis disease management as a part of a cannabis webinar in 2022, and have produced a handful of fact sheets as well. Over the last 2 years, I've been able to be a part of Nova Scotia's pilot long cane raspberry program as well, which has been a great example of the innovation we can support in the province, as well as provide the necessary teaching and expertise to facilitate smooth transition to a new production system. And before we get to the good stuff, I just want to mention a few upcoming events that we have as well. So first off, we are going to be doing a second installment of our Managing Nitrogen in Protected Soil-Based Systems. And this session is going to focus primarily on setting yourself up to do split applications of nitrogen. So for those of you who missed part 1 or want to revisit part 1, we have that posted on our YouTube channel. Oh, I think I did that in the wrong order. Okay, here is our YouTube channel. Specifically, we have a greenhouse production playlist. So that's where we're going to be posting this session, the previous session, the upcoming session, and any other greenhouse work. I also just wanted to draw attention here to our learning page, and this is where you can register for this managing nitrogen in soil-based systems part 2, and that will take place April 13th for a lunch and learn session. All right, so it's finally time for me to welcome our guest. Judson Reid is the Senior Extension Associate at Cornell University and has both undergraduate and graduate degrees in agriculture from Cornell. Judson manages a series of research and educational projects for greenhouse, high tunnel, and field production of fresh market vegetables. He's been involved in the evaluation of grafting tomatoes, biological pest control, cover cropping techniques, and soil nutrient management in protected agriculture. So quite a wealth of knowledge when it comes to soil-based production. And so we're so fortunate to have Judson Reid here today with us. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to him.
Wonderful. Thank you, Talia. I'm coming through okay, I hope.
Yes.
Awesome. So again, good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Perennia and Talia, for hosting this. I'm going to talk today about growing cover crops for improved nutrient cycling and soil health. This is part of the On-Farm Climate Action Fund for Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Labrador. And what we're trying to do here is help improve soil by protecting it from erosion and adopting beneficial management practices that are going to store carbon and reduce greenhouse gases. And so cover crops in particular are going to be a very relevant best management practice in regards to this fund. To remind everyone, we are talking about protected settings. Sometimes we call these high tunnels, sometimes we call them soil-based greenhouses. I don't get caught up in that in those terms. We're talking about protected agriculture, and it's really soil-based is the unifying factor here today. Similar to what Talia mentioned at the beginning, we do need to kind of just lay a little bit of groundwork. So in case you missed the first one, we have a common language or common understanding, but there's not going to be a lot of repeat in my content, just a little bit so that we all know where we're coming from. And I will point out, this is a picture from one of our research plots. I took this just yesterday. You can see the soil, and hopefully you can see some of our cover crop residue on top of that soil. And this as a research site is going to play a factor in our discussion here today. I'm going to begin with my conclusion. And when I talk about homegrown, what I mean is homegrown nutrition, in particular nitrogen. And my messages today are that soil-based greenhouses need some love. They need some additional attention. Winter cover crops, so when we're growing a fruiting vegetable, that off-season or cool season, cold season, we can grow winter cover crops that scavenge and fix nitrogen, improving our soil health. Mm-hmm. If we're going to do that, the seeding date and then possibly the application of a row cover are critical to maximizing the biomass and nitrogen that we develop in this system. The earlier we plant that cover crop, we can influence positively the growth of our legumes, peas in particular. If, for a number of reasons, we are forced to plant a cover crop later, our winter grains are going to be more effective at scavenging nitrogen. This system isn't perfect by a long shot. In other words, there are some reasons to not grow cover crops. One of those is that it excludes the production of a winter crop, greens, obviously being the most common one, spinach, etc. Mm-hmm. We do perpetuate certain pests or have the potential to perpetuate them. Mm-hmm. And we have to figure out a way to work that cover crop into the soil. And we know that each pass we make with tillage, we are burning organic matter and possibly creating some compaction layers. Mm-hmm. So again, for that level set, the working premise here is that our crop health, crop yield, profitability is tied to our soil health. And our soil health, we break into three major dimensions. Those are chemical or nutrient, physical health. So in other words, the ability of that soil to create spaces for root growth, water, and air. And then the third dimension here that we're going to really hit on today is biological. And so the diversity and function of the microbial community within our soil. All of that, the premise is that leads to crop health. All soils contain the nutrients that we need to grow our crop: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sulfur, and then our micronutrients that are listed here. Those are all present in the soil. However, they are not present in the relative proportion or amount that we need to maximize our yield. So we tend to add fertility to that system. There's three tests that guide our nutrient applications. This is from our first session in February. Those three tests are a soil test, a water test, and a foliar test. This is where it's important that you work with Perennia. I have a lot of information to share, but Talia and her colleagues at Perennia have much greater knowledge of the soils of your province. And so work with them for these three tests. Once we take those tests, particularly the first two, soil and water, and then in-season foliar tests, we respond by adding nutrients to the system. And this is a setup where we can add any soluble nutrient through an injector to correct a deficiency, etc. Some people choose not to use a soluble fertility source for their soil-based greenhouses, and instead, and we can see here, may choose to use a bulk form of, say, a meal, alfalfa meal, feather meal, soy meal, etc., or a compost. So you have two different approaches there, and oftentimes it's a combination that we see in practice: a pre-plant bulk application of nutrients followed by soluble injected fertility throughout the season. Now, this is where I say that these protected ag settings need some love, because too much of a good thing is not a good thing. And here I share a soil test. I'm going to draw your attention to the lower right-hand corner. The percent OM, that stands for percent organic matter. And we're at an extremely high level here, nearly 20%. Our soils naturally don't reach that. It's through the addition of all of that compost that we approach that level. When we do that, we drive some of these values very high. So now this is reported in pounds per acre. It doesn't matter if your test is in ppm. We can work with those as well. But our calcium here is extremely high. I could remove an entire digit from that value and still have an acceptable amount of calcium. So in other words, I'm at 10 times the calcium level I want to be at. My phosphorus level here is at 30 times where I'd really like to be. And my soil pH here is at 7.5. I'd love to have that a full point lower at 6.5. All of those imbalances that I'm showing you in this soil test are really because we have loved that soil to death by adding so much organic matter, and it drives those other values out of whack. Seeing this happen over the years, we've had a question: can we improve our fertility without driving those values out of whack? When we add that much organic matter to the soil, I want to point out some other things that happen. Here I have three additional tests. They are CO2 burst, SLAN, which stands for soil labile amino nitrogen, and VAST. VAST refers to soil aggregation. And what you can see here in CO2 burst, which is a measure, really it's a snapshot of our soil microbial community. How much CO2 is it putting out there in a single burst? In other words, what's its respiration rate? In this soil, I have a moderate amount of microbial activity using that test. Soil labile amino nitrogen, that is my background level of nitrogen. So nitrogen that's not quite ready in a plant usable form yet, but can be if it's mineralized. I have a very high level. And so these are common values for those protected ag soils that have seen a lot of compost. But then my VAST, and I forget what that acronym stands for, but what I'm looking at is the soil aggregation. How well does that soil form aggregates? Those aggregates are both organic matter and the mineral fraction glued together by humus or other exudates in the soil that create these stable soil aggregates. And they're stable in a couple of ways. One is that they're going to resist erosion in a rainfall event. They're going to stay together, and they create spaces that plant roots can both grow around and they can grow into. So our soil aggregates help us both resist drought and resist flooding, create a crop that is more resilient in the face of those two extremes. It was a bit counterintuitive, but think about those soil aggregates as being spaces where roots can grow into or around. In this case, we can see that the soil aggregate aggregation in the soil is actually low. And that is because we've achieved that high organic matter value that I shared with you artificially. We brought in a compost that's already been finished. And since it's already at that kind of dead state, it's not going through further decomposition, that means that the soil biology there is not putting out any exudates, not creating any additional humus that's going to glue together our soil aggregates. So, is there a way for us to create those aggregates? I'm going to try to share a video now. And Talia, if you can just give me a verbal or thumbs up that this is indeed working.
Yeah, I
Hi,
can
Judson
see it
Reid,
and I
Cornell
can hear it.
program.
Thank you, Talia.
I'd like to share with you some of the ideas behind our current research in cover cropping in high tunnels. They're often cropped very intensively, particularly in tomatoes, but other fruiting vegetables in the warm season, as well as leafy greens in the colder months. So as these soils are cropped very intensively, often year-round, a lot of soil degradation happens in multiple ways. There are compaction issues. There are issues around salt buildup. pH in particular begins to climb in these soils. And then a number of nutrients become unbalanced. In particular, we see excess levels of calcium, phosphorus, and magnesium in these soils, which then restrict the uptake of other important nutrients such as potassium or the micronutrient manganese during a fruiting vegetable crop.
Perhaps cover cropping is one way high tunnel growers can begin to turn their soil health around. In this trial, we're focusing in on winter cover crop rotations. A few questions we're trying to answer include 1. Are cover crops a good fit for high tunnel tomato systems? 2. Which cover crops work best in this setting? 3. How important is seeding date? 4. Can we scavenge or fix enough nitrogen via these cover crops so that growers can reduce the amount of soluble nitrogen they have to add to the soil? And finally, is row cover an effective means of increasing biomass and subsequent nitrogen contributions?
You can see in the back some of our plots that include legumes. In particular, we're growing an Austrian winter pea or field pea that can fix nitrogen, I should say. So those legumes are able to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere into their root zone. And then ideally, that nitrogen will break down over the growing season. We also have a winter grain called triticale that not only helps the legume get started, it also is really good at taking up free nitrogen in the soil and putting it into a vegetative form. So what our cooperating farmer here intends to do is take all of this cover crop that you see behind me, and he's going to incorporate that with a tiller into the soil a couple weeks before he transplants tomatoes. And then we measure the impact of this cover crop on the soil nitrogen levels, as well as the crop's nitrogen levels in its foliage, as well as the yield impact of the cover crop.
When we rip up a handful of plants in the spring, we can see the fibrous root system of the triticale. We also see nodules on our field pea roots, and inside those nodules is a pinkish hue from the protein leg hemoglobin, which tells us that our rhizobia are happy and healthy and fixing nitrogen.
So each one of these flags denotes a different plot or a different treatment in terms of the species of the cover crop, and the different treatments in terms of, do we apply a row cover to that as well.
In the summer, you'll find me harvesting tomatoes on a weekly basis. Here we're recording marketable and unmarketable fruit weight and number in order to determine if cover cropping has an impact on tomato yield or quality.
So what are some of our conclusions? We're still only a couple of years into this research and have a ways to go, but we do have some early takeaways. One very important one is the use of row covers. Row covers greatly increase the amount of biomass in our cover crop. Next is seeding date. The earlier our seeding date in the fall, the more biomass we're able to produce. Next, the use of legumes such as winter peas can increase the total amount of nitrogen that we produce. However, those peas are going to be most successful with an earlier planting date as well as the use of row cover.
Moving forward, we are continuing to research cover crop seeding rates. We'll begin evaluating soil microbial health in response to cover cropping, and we'll be working with urban farmers
in New York
above
City
Great.
to evaluate the impact of cover cropping in urban soils.
All right. Very good. And I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint now. So the video I just shared covers the basic concept of us trying to grow a cover crop in the wintertime and then measuring, does that have any impact on yield? We are also evaluating the amount of nitrogen we're fixing in biomass of the different treatments. I'm not going to get too hung up on the individual treatments, but the major takeaway points here, I'll throw them in, is the earlier your cover cropping window, the more opportunity you have to get a legume in there. If you're later in the fall and getting that cover crop in there, you're going to favor our winter grains that germinate and grow in those cooler conditions better. Those winter grains, wheat, barley, rye, triticale. When we grow our cover crop in the fall, we like to irrigate that in, this is a practical point, with a fair amount of water, if we can. The reason being is we want to move through the soil profile any salts that have built up from fertilizer applications in season. So I just wanted to share that practice. And then after we've performed that irrigation event, kind of creating a rain event in a sense inside, hopefully we see the germination here in the fall and growth throughout the winter time. However, most of that growth is going to occur in the fall, earlier fall, more growth, and late winter, early spring. So right now, today is the 23rd of March, we've been watching a fair amount of growth from our cover crops for a little bit over a month. Where I am on the globe, about mid-February, plant growth resumes because I have enough photo intensity or sunlight to make that happen. This row cover that we're talking about, if you're a vegetable grower, a diversified vegetable grower, maybe you're familiar with this already as a way to protect against pests outdoors, protect against frost outdoors. We had this idea of, we've got row cover around, can we throw it on top of the cover crop, increase the heat units in that soil, and increase our biomass? Short answer is yes. So for, again, an input that we already have on farm, we're going to increase our biomass from the cover crop, and we're reducing our fertilizer inputs, hopefully. Once we are 2 to 3 weeks away from transplanting our warm season fruiting vegetable, most of the time tomatoes, we will then incorporate that crop. And so you can see there, the farmer is using a single shank, what we call a chisel plow or a deep ripper, and with additional weight on that. And the idea there is to drop that into the soil as much as possible and hopefully shatter any compaction layers that might be in there. And then after we have done that pass, you could do this with a moldboard plow as well. Or if your cover crop's not too big, you could kill it with simply a rototiller. I am working with farmers who are using tarps as well to kill the cover crop, and then they're hoping to no-till transplant, in a sense, into that killed cover crop. That's something we're just learning about. It is exciting to me in the sense that we would reduce the amount of tillage we're putting the soil through, but we're going to need additional time for that process to occur. Whereas here in a day or two, you've killed and incorporated the cover crop. Now, just because we've killed and incorporated it doesn't mean that soil is ready for transplants. We still like to give it 2 or 3 weeks to avoid a nitrogen tie-up, because we've just introduced a lot of biomass into the soil, and that soil biology is going to need to begin to break that down. And in some cases, the case of rye, there's actually a transplant back window that you want to avoid of 2 to 3 weeks as well. Real quick, some of the data from our work, when we look at our combination of a winter grain combined with a legume, we are growing, I forgive the pounds per acre here, but about a ton of biomass with an early planting. So tunnel 1 and tunnel 3 are just simply different planting dates. Say tunnel 1 would be a September date compared to tunnel 3 being an October date. All of these values are great. I just pointed out what some of the higher values are, and the higher values are early date, combining 2 species, and the use of row cover. Row cover does increase our biomass, and the red circles here, you can see I gained about 4,000 pounds in this case of biomass simply by adding, well, about 3,000 pounds by adding that row cover. Just for the row cover alone, I'm gaining 3,000 pounds on a per acre basis of biomass. Now, to move from biomass to actually rates of nitrogen, similar findings. Earlier plantings, combination of a legume and a grain and row cover gives us our higher rates. And again, these are in pounds per acre, but the actual nitrogen that we're able to take from that cover crop is about 100 pounds in this year's trial. And we've done this for a number of years. It looks a little different year to year. I'm not suggesting that all of that nitrogen is available immediately to the crop. I'm not suggesting that it's all available there even in the first year after a cover crop. What I am going to suggest is that it creates background nitrogen. If our soil microbiology is healthy, will be mineralized and available to the crop on an ongoing basis. I wanted to share here some of that microbial data that supports that concept. So here I'm back on CO2 burst, and you don't have to pay attention to all these different colored lines, but you'll notice that this blue line is at a value of about 200 parts per million compared to this green line, which is around 50 parts per million. And as a reminder, CO2 burst is a snapshot of microbial respiration or activity. The blue line happened to correspond to the plots where we had the highest amount of biomass in that year. And the green line corresponds to what we call our control plots, which are bare ground plots that were left uncropped over time, over the winter time. So a bare soil compared to our highest biomass soil, this was reassuring to us. We are indeed seeing differences in our microbial communities. Now, why does that matter for crop health? Because we're growing tomatoes or cucumbers or spinach. We aren't growing microbes, right? Okay. Where we have our cover crops, let's see if I can read this. This is our most recent data. This is the first time I'm actually sharing this data. What we can see here, I've got to move my Zoom toolbar, I'm sorry. Control refers to plots that do not have a cover crop. And then you can see we have oats and vetch or just plain oats. And what this is our carbon and nitrogen microbial biomass, again expressed in a parts per million basis. Don't get too tied up on the values themselves. What I want you to look at is the relative percent of those values compared to each other. So if we look at the microbial biomass in carbon, those are the blue bars, and we compare our oats and vetch to no cover crop at all, we move from about 450 parts per million where we had a cover crop to around 300 parts per million in this case of how much of that microbial biomass is in that carbon form. So when we're looking at sequestering carbon, it's quite clear from this data that a cover crop does more for us than leaving it alone. So this is exciting data for us. It's confirming our hypotheses. And then again, I mentioned we're growing tomatoes or cucumbers. We're growing a vegetable or some specialty crop. We're not growing microbes per se. Why does this matter? In this, we can see the mineralization, and this is actually a rate of mineralization, where we have a cover crop compared to no cover crop. We have about a 50% increase, no, about a 25% increase in the rate of nitrogen that's being mineralized into a nitrate form, so a plant available form where we have cover crops. So all of this data, as I piece it together, shows me that I can increase biomass, I can increase the nitrogen that's in the soil, and I can increase the function or presence of microbes in the soil, which then liberate or mineralize that nitrogen for my crop to use. To bring us back to this slide of looking at soil health beyond nutrition, the argument I'm making is, down in that last one, those soil aggregates, by really composting that cover crop in sight, I'm going to contribute to that value as well. Now, this is a dynamic system. All of agriculture is. And what do I mean by a dynamic system? I mean a system that has a number of complex factors and a number of complex relationships between those factors leading to an outcome. Some of those for you might include your market. What are your markets? Because those markets influence when can you plant a cover crop. That's a very important dynamic influence on your system, on your farm. The other dynamic component here I'll mention is temperature. And so here I have 3 years of temperature data, and those differ considerably as well, which also influences microbial activity considerably. So there is no recipe that all farms can employ. What you can do is take this information, again, consult with Talia and her colleagues at Perennia, and come up with a plan that is most applicable to your farm, recognizing that it's a dynamic system and going to change based on temperature, based on markets, based on your labor availability, based on equipment you have on your farm. That dynamic of temperature in particular plays a role in our root zone health. And here I have data that shows that earlier plantings indoors tend to have a lower yield. Well, they almost always do in our data. So the orange bar in this chart represents an April planting, and the blue bars represent a March planting. And you can see, again, on a pound per plant basis here, in some of our treatments, we're losing out on close to 5 pounds per plant, or a couple kilos per plant. That's a significant impact in terms of total yield. So that's something that's very difficult for us to manipulate, which is root zone temperature. I can add all that biomass, influence my microbes, my background nitrogen levels, my soil aggregation. I have very limited ability to influence root zone temperature. Knowing that colder soils tend to reduce our total yield, farmers still want to plant early. And here I have wholesale price data from my local area, and this is US dollars per pound. And we can see in May, farmers are receiving on a wholesale basis close to $4 per pound, compared to September. Actually, even in late August here, I'm below $1 US per pound for those same tomatoes. So seeing that price differential, farmers are increasingly ending their tomato crop indoors in favor of growing a cover crop, because to my earlier points, the sooner I get in that space in the fall or late summer, the more biomass I can produce, the more nitrogen, etc. These were our peas in winter of 2022 and 2023. So this year's crop, you can see we planted early because of those dynamic factors I mentioned. We had tremendous growth with the peas, probably too much. They lodged, and we're seeing some aphids and gray mold come in there. So again, going back to my earlier point, this system is not perfect by a long shot. How would you as a farmer begin to implement some of these ideas on your farm? And you can see here, this is a multi-bay set of tunnels in one. The farmer's still harvesting tomatoes here to the right-hand side of my screen, whereas here in the center, they have drilled in a buckwheat cover crop. When and how do we make those decisions? I'm going to lay out a few possible scenarios where we can look at a calendar basis for rotating in either a cover crop or a fruiting vegetable. And so here I have 12 months of the calendar year and a greens crop, which could be, say, spinach or some other green, that needs to go in the ground in early fall and then might be terminated in very early spring. And then I have my tomatoes there during the warmer season. My back of the envelope estimation here is a fairly high revenue situation. In this case, it is a 30 by 96 foot greenhouse. Again, forgive my imperial units there. I'm expecting to gross close to 20 grand out of that space by cropping year round. I'm perpetuating certain pests when I do that, and I'm degrading the soil. I'm really putting nothing back into that soil. I'm only taking from it. A fruiting vegetable followed by a leafy green, rinse and repeat. High revenue, very hard on the soil. What if I were to keep that same fruiting vegetable more or less between April and October, but I was able to grow a cover crop in there? I have reduced my revenue in this case by around $6,000. I'm going to skip over this concept of baskets for now. And I'll mention that the cover crop then is improving physical, biological, and nutrient status of my soil. Remember, those are the 3 dimensions of soil health. I did that again at the cost of the revenue that the greens were bringing me. Let's apply that same analysis to another fruiting vegetable, in this case, cucumbers, which I'll point out here. I'm having a slightly lower total potential revenue, even when I grow them in rotation with greens. And they're tying up the soil from mid-June to the end of October, followed by another greens crop, which actually keeps the soil occupied for 6 months. In this case, I could cheat in a cover crop in late March and have it out again in mid-June. I really like this scenario because I am using these warmer months to grow my cover crop prior to the cucumber. It's giving me more a broader diversity of cover crops to choose from because I'm into some slightly warmer months here compared to the wintertime. And I'm giving this a moderate soil health contribution on my highly subjective scale. What if I were to take that same rotation, but I were to change the calendar windows for the cover crop and the greens? If you'll notice, my revenue stays about the same, around $14,000 per 3,000 square feet of greenhouse. I'm giving this excellent soil building rating. The difference here is that I have a cover crop for 6 months from October to March, followed by a greens crop, followed by a cucumber crop. The reason my revenue stays the same here is that these greens, again, let's go with spinach, you could also do lettuce, are going to give me the same yield in the months of April, May, and June as they will over the 6 months of October, November, December, January, February, March, because the growth is slow or non-existent during those winter months. So that's where I prefer the cover crop, because even though it might not be growing vigorously in those winter months, it is sustaining a microbial population, which again leads to improved nitrogen mineralization, as our data showed. So farmers that I'm working with that have adopted this approach, this is some of their self-reported impacts. These aren't my sets of data. 85% of those I've surveyed on this report they've been able to increase their organic matter, about 50% decrease disease, about 50% report they can decrease their nitrogen inputs, and close to 70% report that they're doing this to increase their soil microbial community. So to draw us back to the conclusions for my talk here this afternoon, those high tunnels definitely need some love. Winter cover crops can help us provide that by scavenging leftover nitrogen from the fertility we provide to our fruiting vegetable and fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere, improving our soil microbial communities. The date is really probably the most important factor for determining which cover crop species you grow and how much biomass are you going to create. Earlier, we can get legumes in there. Later, we look at grains. And then again, the system, like everything in agriculture, isn't perfect. It has some flaws. So in April, we're going to take this conversation to the next step, which is looking at how do we, in a sense, combine our knowledge of protected agriculture and our knowledge of managing soil, field soil, which is really where we come together in this. That's going to require a combination of some science from our hydroponic friends, as well as our outdoor colleagues in agriculture. And we've got to account for the banks of nutrients that are already in the soil and other factors, and then make information-based decisions. So I really look forward to that, that session. Warning, it is going to include some math. Again, thanks to Talia and Perennia for inviting me to speak here today. You can follow me online if you'd like. Here's a couple of my socials. And I'm done.
Awesome, Judson. Thank you so much. So with that, I think we're going to dive into a couple questions. So cover cropping, or not cover cropping. Obviously, we're talking about cover cropping, but using row covers on cover crops.
Yeah.
Do you typically leave the cover on all the time, or are you taking it off during the day?
Yeah, that's a great question. I should provide some more detail on how we do that. To answer the question directly, once we put the row cover on, we do not take it off. Now the question is, when do we apply it? And this is where my farmer cooperator gets a lot of credit in that he does not like to apply that row cover too early in the winter or fall, because we do want some freezing temperatures to enter that space and provide us with some, the benefits that we get from winter. Killing some insects, killing some annual weeds, hopefully reducing some of our pathogens or diseases. So we would apply that row cover, depending, each year is different, but after we feel like we've had a couple weeks of below freezing temperatures. So that's probably going to put us into maybe a December or January application, and then leaving it on and then taking it off probably in March.
And when you say below freezing, are you looking at your indoor temperature at that point or the outdoor one?
Yeah, that's a great question, Talia. We're looking at the indoor temperature.
Okay.
Yeah, kill as many bugs as we can with temperature.
Yeah, absolutely. And okay, I'm gonna try to stick on the row cover train a little bit here. Okay, I think that's it. Next topic then. Is there a cover crop that can reduce pythium in soils before planting cucumbers?
Ooh, great question. I'm probably going to get myself into trouble. I don't believe that pythium is particularly active on our grasses. So I wonder if those winter grains that I mentioned, barley, wheat, triticale, rye, probably are not going to at least perpetuate pythium. Now there's multiple species of pythium, right? And they are active at different temperatures, and they particularly love cool, moist soils, and they do like cucumbers too. So the best thing you can do, in my mind, to manage pythium is to avoid those cold soils for cucumbers in particular.
And so that kind of ties into, I think you had a slide that this was sort of the farmer reported, benefits of cover cropping, that they saw a decrease in disease. Are you able to elaborate on that?
I can't elaborate on it too much because that is just farmer generated response. I don't have which diseases they mentioned, but I would conjecture that they're talking about their fruiting crop, which is almost always tomatoes, summertime tomatoes. And so probably what we're looking at there is botrytis gray mold. I would imagine is probably the one they're thinking of most. And then there are some other foliar diseases that we do get indoors. One is called brown leaf mold. We manage that mainly through resistant varieties today. And I'll probably stop. I should stop there. Because,
and so I guess the reduction in disease, is that maybe like a shorter cropping cycle to facilitate the cover crops, or is it just like the change up in the crop group that you're growing?
I think the hypothesis is that it's adding a non-related species in there.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Great.
So could you speak to what you're seeing so far with the use of tarps to terminate?
Yeah, I hope I could give you an update on that in a few weeks. It's the species are the same, the dates are the same, everything is the same, except the grower is going to put in what they call a silage tarp. It is popular. It has some applications for outdoor vegetable cropping as well. that's as much update as I can provide. Will we effectively be able to kill it? We don't know yet.
Yeah, and we definitely acknowledge that this is very new.
Yeah.
You're only a couple years in, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of questions, a lot of combinations. We even have to facilitate temperature year after year.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
No.
I would love it if it works.
Yeah, that'd be pretty sweet.
Yeah.
And then so what sort of you kind of touched on it, but what are sort of the termination methods that you're seeing, or maybe you would recommend work better than others?
Yeah, absolutely. So in some years, depending on the amount of biomass we have, it is simply a tractor mounted rototiller. You could use a walk behind rototiller as well. And if the biomass isn't too big, we can do that. Next level up is to mow the cover crop. And I actually think that might be a nice idea. You're probably going to speed the degradation of it, or, if you were to mow it and then incorporate it. And then like level 3, or the most intense method, is to plow it and then rototill it. So we can either plow it with a moldboard plow, which flips the cover crop and creates that traditional furrow that we see. And then that seed bed really still needs to be worked up in order to make raised beds. So then a rototill pass, or in the case of the chisel plow, it doesn't make those nice furrows, but it terminates the crop by ripping up those clumps of cover crop and then rototilling again.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so if you have a soil that is already excessive in nitrogen, is there an advantage to using peas as a cover crop?
Oh, that's a great question. And again, I'm in the space of kind of guessing and hypothesizing. One thought I have, and have observed anecdotally, is that in high nitrogen soils, the legumes become lazy, is what we say. And we see less nodules and less growth in general. So probably not. My quick answer to that question is, if I had a high-end soil, I would probably prefer a grain in there, so that it's mopping up all of that free nitrogen, and it grows quicker, and it's going to put all of that into a vegetative form.
Hey,
peas, yeah.
You're doing great. We're throwing you a lot of stuff here.
Yeah.
So does triticale have some of the allelopathic properties like rye?
Great question. So just so that we're all speaking the same language, allelopathy, of course, it means kind of a plant-to-plant toxicity or inhibitor. And so rye is renowned for that, in that immediately after incorporating rye, there's problems with seed germination, and with transplanted crops, there's sometimes a transplant shock, where those things will sit there for a while due to some compounds in the rye. And triticale is a cross between rye and wheat. So I imagine that there is likely some allelopathy to that crop. I don't have any science behind that, but I would be surprised if there wasn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Do your farmers do a 2 or 3 year rotation?
My farmers do a 2 or 3 year rotation. They do a 1 year rotation. They grow tomatoes and tomatoes and tomatoes and tomatoes, because that's where they make the most money. And occasionally I can suggest that they move to a 2 year rotation that might include a fruiting vegetable, a cover crop, let's say tomatoes, cover crop, and again, a greens crop, and then maybe a cucumber crop, cover crop, tomato crop. Adoption of that level of rotation hasn't been great. And in order for it to work, most farmers need tomatoes every year, and they like the benefits of these greenhouses. So what it means is you're going to have several of them. So you can work through a cycle, always have tomatoes someplace, and hopefully always have a cover crop going someplace.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the best of both worlds in that case. And so if you are seeing 2 or 3 year rotations, are they effective in the nutrients that you have discussed?
They are. And so I have a farm comes to mind that practices this, and they are able to manage these nutrients, but it is coupled with the testing and more precision nutrient application that we touched on in February, and we're going to hit again on April 13th. That is how they're able to achieve that nutrient balance is bringing together cover cropping rotations, but at the same time still testing and precision application.
Yeah, and we just had a fantastic webinar on the 21st, so 2 days ago, on basically looking at the economic sort of benefits of cover cropping and whether it makes sense for you. And they had a point that I liked a lot where they were saying, you look at it as an investment, the same way you look at liming as an investment, the same way that you look at farm machinery like an investment. You don't really implement those practices thinking they're going to pay themselves off in that first year. And it's really about that longevity.
I like that. I think that's a great way to look at that. I might start suggesting people consider that too. Yeah, that's
yeah. Great. It was a fantastic webinar. So for anyone who wasn't on it, it was definitely more geared towards field crops. I think corn and soybean were used a lot, but I thought there were some really interesting take homes there. And so I guess just to finish us off here, do you have any mixes that you like more so than others?
Well, that's a great question. We've kept things pretty simple up till now, looking at Austrian winter peas or field peas, same thing with grains. And what we've looked at is different ratios of those. And it's not worth spending a lot of time on that right now, but parallel to this, where we're doing our research, we have another high tunnel where this winter we have a mix of clover. I think it's a red clover, tillage radish, triticale, and there's some field peas in there. And again, very anecdotally, what I'm enjoying seeing there is that there's kind of an ebb and flow in growth between those 4 species. And what fascinates me is the idea that at different temperatures and different day lengths, we might be getting a benefit from each one of those. Now, I don't want to go crazy and start looking at a dozen, but I do like the idea of several in there. Right now, it's kind of has my attention. This radish, legume, and a grain together. So at least 3 together.
That's cool.
Yeah, it is cool.
Yeah. It's okay. I'm on board there too. Okay. And my just kind of a final question. So you talked about, you're watering your soils before you implement those cover crops. What is sort of your water management strategy for a cover crop? Like how often are you looking after those?
Yeah, that's a great question, Talia. It's parallel to our winter greens water management in that probably by for us, late November, we do not water.
Yeah. Okay.
And do not water again. Actually, we probably never water it. We incorporate it before it needs water almost. So watering it in, and then we're done with it.
So it's really just that kind of initial establishment, and after that.
Yep.
Okay.
And since it's winter time, now we don't have to deal with any frozen pipes, so we can shut off the water and be done with it.
Make our lives a bit easier.
Yeah.
Yep, that's fantastic. And we just had one last question come in here. So what was the planting date on the mix that you were just talking about?
Great question. Our planting date there, this is an approximate, but that was probably around October, somewhere between October 1 and October 10 for us this year. And so again, I'll stop there.
Okay, that is great. So I'm just going to try to pop up my screen here. Yes, so thank you everybody so much for your time, your attention, all of your awesome questions. I think this was a really great discussion. And I'm certainly looking forward to sort of building on that. And so we have done some very preliminary cover crop trials in Nova Scotia. By that, I mean we have done one in this past winter. But I'm definitely looking forward to building on that and, trying to understand how that is working in our climates, especially as we're seeing these sort of longer, warmer, sunnier falls and these delayed winters. So I posted a few QR codes here for you to check out upcoming events, either those listed through OFCAF primarily or the ones that Perennia is hosting. And if anyone has any follow-up questions to the session, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself and we can point you in the right direction. So I will be sending out the link for the recording as well as a follow-up survey for today. So if you can take the time, share your thoughts with us, we would highly appreciate it. Again, I'm going to apologize for our tech issues, but I think we learned a lot, so that's all good. So thank you again, Judson, for taking the time to speak to us today. And we will see you all April 13th.
Thanks, Talia. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.